For 23 years, Grace Walker believed nobody had ever come back for her. An orphan girl with no family, no answers, and no place to belong. She spent her childhood watching other children leave with families while she remained behind. Then she bought an abandoned church. Hidden beneath its floorboards were hundreds of forgotten World War II letters and a family secret buried for more than 70 years. A secret connected to a soldier who never came home. A secret connected to Grace herself. And if those letters had remained hidden just a little longer, the truth might have been lost forever. Because beneath that church was the answer to the question Grace had carried her entire life. Why had nobody ever come back for her? Grace Walker spent most of her life believing she had been forgotten. Not hated. Not abandoned on purpose. Just forgotten. Like an old photograph tucked away in a drawer, nobody opens anymore. Every Christmas Eve at St. Mary's Orphanage, children waited in the dining hall wearing their best clothes. Families would arrive throughout the day. Names would be called, one by one. Children would leave holding the hands of people who had chosen them. Grace always waited. At 7 years old, she waited by the window. At 10, she kept her little suitcase packed beside her chair. By 16, she stopped bringing the suitcase altogether. Nobody was coming. At least, that's what she had learned to believe. One winter, while helping clean the orphanage office, Grace found her adoption file. Most children had thick folders. Hers contained a single page. Under known relatives, there were only 2 words. Unknown. None. She stared at those words for a long time, because for the first time, she wondered if anyone had ever searched for her at all. Years later, after aging out of the orphanage, Grace built a quiet life for herself in Willow Creek, Kentucky. She worked long hours at a roadside diner. Morning shifts became night shifts. Weekends disappeared. Every extra dollar went into a small savings account. She wasn't saving for a vacation or a new car. She was saving for something she had never truly had. A place to belong. Then, one rainy October morning, she found an online listing for an abandoned church. Willow Hill Church, built in 1919. Closed for more than 30 years. Price $5,000. The building looked worn and tired. The white paint had faded. The stained glass windows were cracked. The bell tower leaned slightly against the gray Kentucky sky. Most people would have seen a ruin. Grace saw something else. She saw a chance. 3 weeks later, she stood at the bottom of the church steps holding the deed in trembling hands. Every dollar she had spent years saving was gone. The wind carried the scent of fallen leaves through the empty churchyard. For a moment, fear settled deep in her chest. What if everyone was right? What if the church couldn't be saved? What if she couldn't either? Then her eyes caught something near the stone foundation. 2 faded initials hidden beneath years of moss. J.C., almost erased by time. Without thinking, Grace brushed her fingers across the letters. A strange feeling passed through her, as if the church had been waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to listen. Grace didn't know who J.C. was. She didn't know a young soldier with those initials had once walked through those doors before leaving for war. She didn't know that hidden beneath the aging floorboards were hundreds of forgotten letters, untouched for more than 70 years. And she certainly didn't know those letters would lead her toward a family secret connected to her own past. A secret powerful enough to change everything she believed about herself. Standing there beneath the gray autumn sky, Grace thought she had just purchased an abandoned church. She was wrong. What she had really found was the beginning of an answer to the question she had carried since childhood. Why had nobody ever come back for her? After 70 years of silence, The church was finally ready to tell its story. The first time Grace unlocked the doors of Willow Hill Church, she expected to feel excited. Instead, she felt small. The old wooden doors groaned as they swung inward, releasing a breath of stale air that had been trapped for decades. Dust floated through the sunlight pouring in from the broken stained glass windows. The silence inside was so deep it almost felt alive. Grace stood in the doorway for a long moment. The church was empty. Not just empty of people. Empty of laughter. Empty of music. Empty of prayer. It felt like a place the world had forgotten. Slowly, she stepped inside. Each footstep echoed across the worn wooden floor. The pews were covered in dust. Several had collapsed entirely. Water stains spread across the ceiling like old scars. In one corner, a section of plaster had fallen away, exposing the aging beams underneath. Most people would have turned around. Most people would have seen a building beyond saving. But Grace had spent her entire life being underestimated. She knew what it felt like when people looked at something broken and decided it wasn't worth the effort. So she stayed. The first week was harder than she imagined. Every day before sunrise, she worked at the diner. Every afternoon, she drove to the church. Every evening, she cleaned until darkness forced her home. She hauled out rotten wood, dragged away rusted metal, filled countless trash bags with debris. By the end of each day, her hands ached and her back burned. More than once. She sat alone on the church steps wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. The money was gone. At the building, he was endless. And the town wasn't exactly cheering her on. Willow Creek was the kind of town where news traveled fast. People noticed everything. Especially when a 23-year-old orphan decided to buy an abandoned church everyone else had written off years ago. At the diner, Grace overheard conversations she wasn't meant to hear. That girl doesn't know what she's gotten herself into. Church ought to be torn down. She's wasting her money. One afternoon, an elderly customer shook his head and said kindly, "Sweetheart, some things are too broken to fix." Grace smiled politely, but those words stayed with her, because deep down she wasn't sure if he was talking about the church or her. Then came the storm. 3 weeks after she bought Willow Hill Church, a powerful autumn storm swept across Kentucky. Rain hammered the roof all night. Wind rattled the windows of Grace's tiny apartment. She barely slept. Every gust made her think about the church standing alone on that hill. She imagined the roof collapsing, the bell tower falling, everything she had worked for being destroyed before it had even begun. Before sunrise, she drove through the rain to see for herself. The road was muddy and nearly washed out. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. When she finally reached the hill, she stopped the truck and stared. The church was still standing, battered, soaked, but standing. Relief rushed through her so suddenly that tears filled her eyes. She climbed the steps and stepped inside. Rainwater had leaked through several holes in the roof. Puddles covered sections of the floor. Pieces of plaster lay scattered across the sanctuary. The damage was real, but something surprised her. The building had endured. After decades of neglect, after 32 years of storms, after being abandoned and forgotten, it was still here. Grace slowly walked down the center aisle. The church seemed different somehow, not weaker, stronger, as if every crack and scar told a story of survival. She stopped near the altar. The morning light pushed through the broken stained glass, painting soft colors across the floor. For the first time, she noticed something carved into one of the front pews. A name, then another, and another. Dozens of names. Generations of people who had once sat here, prayed here, married here, buried loved ones here. The church wasn't empty at all. It was full of memories, full of stories. And suddenly, Grace understood why she couldn't walk away. This wasn't just about restoring a building. It was about preserving something people had forgotten mattered, something she understood better than anyone, because she knew exactly what it felt like to be forgotten. That morning, she made a decision. She wasn't going to sell the church. She wasn't going to quit. No matter how long it took, no matter how difficult it became, Willow Hill Church deserved another chance. And maybe, so did she. As she turned to leave, her eyes drifted once more toward the faded initials carved into the stone foundation outside. J.C. The letters seemed insignificant, just 2 marks left behind by someone long gone. Yet, for reasons she couldn't explain, she found herself thinking about them again, wondering who that person had been, wondering what story had been left behind. She had no way of knowing that buried beneath her feet was a secret waiting to be uncovered, a secret that had survived wars, heartbreak, and 70 years of silence. And very soon, that secret was about to find her. It started with a sound, not a loud sound, not something that would have caught anyone else's attention, just a dull thud beneath the floor. Grace had been working alone that afternoon. The church was quiet except for the steady scrape of her broom against the old wooden boards. Outside, the last golden leaves of autumn drifted across the churchyard. Inside, dust danced through beams of sunlight. She was sweeping near the front of the sanctuary when she heard it. Thunk. She stopped. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. Then she tapped the floor again with the broom handle. Most of the boards sounded solid, but one section near the altar answered differently. Hollow. Grace frowned. She knelt down and brushed away years of dirt and dust. The wood looked slightly newer than the surrounding boards. Not new exactly, just different, as if someone had repaired that section long ago, or hidden something beneath it. A strange feeling settled in her stomach. The same feeling she had experienced when she first saw the initials J.C., curiosity, and something else, something she couldn't quite explain. The next morning, she returned with a pry bar and a flashlight. For nearly an hour she worked carefully, removing nails weakened by time. Finally, one of the boards lifted free. A cool draft escaped from below. Grace froze. Her heartbeat quickened. She pulled away another board, then another, and there it was. A narrow opening hidden beneath the church floor. For several seconds she simply stared. The darkness below seemed endless, as though it had been waiting undisturbed for decades, and maybe longer. Most people would have called someone. Most people would have walked away. But Grace had spent her whole life searching for answers, and answers rarely came to people who turned around. She switched on the flashlight and carefully lowered herself through the opening. The air below was cool and damp. Stone walls surrounded her. A small staircase descended into darkness. Each step creaked softly beneath her weight. The deeper she went, the colder it became. Finally, the staircase opened into a hidden room. Grace stood motionless. The room was larger than she expected. Old wooden shelves lined the walls. Dust covered everything. Boxes, crates, metal containers, and dozens upon dozens of sealed packages stacked carefully in rows. It looked less like a storage room and more like a time capsule, a place forgotten by history. For several moments, she could only stare. Then her flashlight landed on something sitting atop one of the shelves. A wooden box. Simple, weathered, and engraved with 2 familiar initials, J.C. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. Slowly, she carried the box to a nearby table. The lid resisted at first. Then it opened. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, neatly bundled together with faded ribbons. Some envelopes were yellow with age. Others were stained and fragile. Every one of them had an address. Every one of them had a name. Many had never been opened. Grace carefully lifted the first letter. The postmark was dated 1944. Her breath caught. World War II. With trembling hands, she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was neat but hurried. The letter began, "My dearest Eleanor, if this letter reaches you, then perhaps God has been kinder to me than I deserve." Grace swallowed hard. She wasn't reading history. She was reading someone's heart, someone's final hopes, someone's final fears. For the next hour, she sat in silence reading fragments of forgotten lives. Letters to wives, letters to mothers, letters to sweethearts, letters to children who may never have known they existed. Some ended with promises to return home. Others spoke of fear. Many spoke of faith. Several ended with words that brought tears to Grace's eyes. "I'll see you soon." She wondered how many of those men never got the chance. The deeper she searched, the more questions emerged. Why had these letters never been delivered? Who had hidden them? And why inside a church? Then she found something different. At the bottom of the box lay a leather journal. The cover was worn smooth by time. Across the front, stamped in faded gold letters, were the initials. J.C. Grace's pulse quickened. Carefully, she opened the first page. The handwriting matched several of the letters. The entry was dated June 1944. The name written beneath it made her stomach tighten. James Carter. For a moment, the room seemed to grow silent around her. James Carter. J.C. The initials on the stone. The initials on the box. The initials in the journal. Whoever he was, he had been important to this place. Very important. Grace turned another page, then another. Each entry revealed pieces of a life interrupted by war. Dreams, fears, plans for the future, and frequent mentions of someone named Eleanor, a woman he clearly loved. But as she reached the final pages, the tone changed. The writing became more urgent, more personal. One particular entry stopped her cold. James wrote about a child, an unborn child. His child. A baby he feared he might never meet. Grace stared at the words. Her chest tightened. Without realizing it, she pressed a hand against the journal. Something about the passage felt important. Bigger than she could explain, as if she had just stepped onto the edge of a story much larger than the church itself, much larger than James Carter, and somehow much larger than her. Above her, the church stood quietly beneath the fading afternoon sky. But down in that hidden room, surrounded by forgotten letters and buried memories, Grace felt the first piece of a mystery beginning to move. She had entered the church looking for a home. Instead, she may have found a secret that had been waiting 70 years to be uncovered. And, for the first time in her life, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that the secret might be connected to her. For the next few days, Grace carried James Carter's journal everywhere she went. Not literally. She left it safely locked inside her apartment whenever she went to work. But mentally, it never left her side. While pouring coffee at the diner, she thought about it. While driving home beneath the fading Kentucky sunsets, she thought about it. Even at night, when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, she found herself replaying the words she had read beneath the church. Something about James Carter refused to leave her alone. At first, Grace told herself it was simple curiosity. Anyone would be fascinated by a hidden room filled with 70-year-old letters. Anyone would want to know who James Carter had been. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Much more. Every evening after work, she returned to Willow Hill Church. She'd spend an hour cleaning, maybe 2. Then she'd sit alone in one of the old pews with James's journal resting in her lap. The church had become quieter since the discovery. Or perhaps Grace had simply started listening. The old building no longer felt abandoned. It felt occupied. Not by ghosts, not by anything frightening, but by memories. The journal was filled with ordinary things. Descriptions of church picnics, fishing trips, Sunday services, stories about neighbors whose names had long since disappeared from town records. James wrote about Willow Creek the way people write about places they love. Every page felt alive, and slowly, Grace began to feel as though she knew him. He wasn't just a soldier. He wasn't just a name carved into stone. He had been a real person. Someone who laughed. Someone who dreamed. Someone who worried about the future. Someone who had sat in these very pews long before she was born. Then one evening, everything changed. Grace was reading beneath the soft glow of a work lamp when she reached an entry dated September 1944. The handwriting looked shakier than usual. James had written it just days before shipping overseas. Grace read slowly. Every word seemed heavier than the last. James wrote about fear. Not fear of war. Not fear of death. Fear of leaving someone behind. Fear of never meeting his child. Grace turned the page, and there it was. A sentence that made her heart stop. If I don't come home, I pray my child never believes I abandoned them. Grace stared at the words. Read them again. Then again. A strange ache spread through her chest. Because for most of her life, abandonment had defined her story. Every unanswered question. Every lonely birthday. Every Christmas spent watching other children leave. All of it traced back to one belief. Someone had left her behind. Someone had chosen not to stay. But James's words challenged that belief. What if some people never leave by choice? What if circumstances steal people away before they have the chance to return? The thought lingered long after she closed the journal. For the first time, Grace wondered if there might be parts of her own story she didn't understand. The following weekend, she visited the county records office. She wasn't looking for anything specific. At least, that's what she told herself. She simply wanted to learn more about James Carter. The clerk pointed her toward old newspaper archives and military records. Hours passed. Most of what she found was ordinary, until she discovered a faded newspaper clipping from 1945. The headline announced the death of Private James Carter overseas. Below the article was a photograph. Grace froze. She had seen that face before. Not in the journal. Not in the church. In her own reflection. Not exactly, but enough to make her stomach tighten. The same eyes. The same jawline. The same smile. She immediately dismissed the thought. Thousands of people looked alike. It meant nothing. It had to mean nothing. Still, she tore out a copy of the article and slipped it into her bag. That night, she couldn't sleep. She found herself sitting at her kitchen table long after midnight. James's journal lay open beside the newspaper clipping. Rain tapped softly against the window. The apartment was silent. Grace looked from the photograph to her own reflection in the dark glass, then back again. The resemblance was probably coincidence, yet something deep inside her whispered otherwise. As dawn approached, she turned back to the journal. One final entry near the end caught her attention. It mentioned Eleanor. And the baby? James wrote that if anything happened to him, He wanted the church to safeguard certain letters until they reach the right hands. The truth deserves to survive, even if I don't. Grace read the sentence 3 times. The truth deserves to survive. The words echoed inside her. Suddenly, restoring the church no longer felt like a construction project. It felt like a responsibility, a mission. Someone had hidden those letters for a reason. Someone had protected them for 70 years, and now they had somehow ended up in her hands. The question was no longer whether she would continue investigating. The question was where the truth would lead, because the more Grace learned about James Carter, the more she began to suspect that she wasn't just uncovering his story. She might be uncovering her own. And for the first time since finding her adoption file all those years ago, she allowed herself to wonder something she had never dared believe. What if she hadn't been forgotten after all? What if someone had been trying to find their way back to her? For generations, the idea came quietly, not in a flash of inspiration, not during some dramatic moment beneath the church's stained glass windows. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening, while Grace sat alone in one of the front pews, surrounded by stacks of letters that hadn't been touched in more than 70 years. Outside, the Kentucky sky was turning orange. Inside, Willow Hill Church was silent. Grace held one of the envelopes in her hands. The paper was fragile now, yellowed by time. On the front was the name of a woman who had likely spent decades never knowing that someone had written to her one last time. Grace stared at the envelope for a long moment. Then a simple thought crossed her mind. What if some of these families were still out there? The idea refused to leave. That night, she carried several letters home and spread them across her kitchen table. One by one, she wrote down names, addresses, dates, military units, any detail that might help identify surviving relatives. Most of the addresses no longer existed. Many of the towns had changed. Some families had probably moved away generations ago. But Grace couldn't stop thinking about James Carter's words. The truth deserves to survive. Maybe that was why the letters had survived. Maybe they had been waiting for someone to finish what had never been completed. The next morning, Grace created a social media page for Willow Hill Church. At first, she felt foolish doing it. She wasn't a historian. She wasn't an investigator. She was just a waitress with an abandoned church and a box of forgotten letters. Still, she posted photographs of a few envelopes. She shared a brief explanation. Then she waited. Nothing happened for almost 3 days. Then a message arrived. A woman from Tennessee recognized her grandfather's name on one of the envelopes. Grace stared at the screen. Her heart raced. After 70 years, someone had found a connection. A week later, the woman drove to Willow Creek. She was nearly 80 years old. Her hands trembled as Grace placed the unopened letter in front of her. For several moments, neither woman spoke. The elderly woman simply stared at the envelope. Then tears began rolling down her cheeks. "My mother waited her whole life for this," she whispered. Grace felt a lump rise in her throat. The letter had been written by the woman's uncle shortly before he was killed in France. Nobody in the family had ever known it existed. As the woman read the words aloud, the church seemed to grow impossibly quiet. The letter wasn't extraordinary. It spoke of family, of missing home, of hoping everyone was safe, but the emotions inside it felt timeless. When she finished reading, the woman reached across the table and squeezed Grace's hand. "You have no idea what this means." For the first time since buying the church, Grace felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about preserving history. She was returning pieces of people's lives. Word began spreading, slowly at first, then much faster. Local newspapers picked up the story. Veterans groups contacted her. Historians offered assistance. People from neighboring states started calling. Each week brought new names, new families, new reunions. The church that everyone had forgotten was becoming something unexpected, a place where lost stories could finally come home. Then, one evening, a package arrived. Inside were copies of military records sent by a retired genealogist from Ohio. The man had read about the church online and volunteered to help identify some of the soldiers. Grace spent hours reviewing the documents. Most contained information she already knew. Then she found James Carter's file. Immediately, her attention sharpened. There wasn't much. A service record, several official notices, a casualty report, but attached to the file was something she hadn't seen before. A handwritten note. The note referenced a child born shortly after James was reported missing. Grace's pulse quickened. She read the sentence again, and then again. The child's name wasn't listed. Neither was the mother's. Only a brief remark, indicating that arrangements had been made through a church-affiliated organization following a family dispute. A family dispute. Grace sat back in her chair. Something about the wording bothered her. People didn't hide information unless they had a reason. Suddenly, James's story felt much larger than she had imagined. For the next several days, she dug deeper. She visited county archives, old church records, historical societies. Everywhere she looked, pieces were missing. Pages had disappeared. Records stopped abruptly. Names were crossed out. The trail seemed to vanish whenever she got close to answers. It didn't feel accidental. It felt deliberate, as if someone had wanted the story buried. One rainy afternoon, Grace visited an elderly former church secretary living in a nearby nursing home. The woman was 94 years old. Her memory wandered at times. But when Grace mentioned James Carter, something changed. The old woman's eyes sharpened. "James," she whispered. "I remember James." Grace leaned forward. The woman stared toward the window for a long moment. Then she spoke quietly. "He wasn't supposed to be forgotten." A chill ran through Grace. "What do you mean?" The woman hesitated, as though deciding whether to reveal something she had carried for decades. There were rumors after the war. What kind of rumors? The old woman looked directly at her. That someone wanted his story to disappear? The room suddenly felt smaller. Grace's heart pounded. "Why?" The woman shook her head slowly. "I don't know." Then she added something that made Grace's breath catch. "But I remember the baby." Grace froze. "The baby?" "James's child. The mother brought the infant here once," the woman said softly. "Only once." Grace struggled to speak. "What happened?" "I don't know. After that, they were gone." Silence filled the room. Then the woman looked at Grace with unexpected intensity. "You have his eyes." The words hit like a thunderclap. Grace's entire body went still. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. The old secretary seemed surprised by her own statement, as if she had only just noticed it herself. "You have the same eyes James had." That night, Grace sat alone inside Willow Hill Church. Rain tapped gently against the stained glass windows. The old journal rested beside her. The letters surrounded her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to consider a possibility she had been afraid to voice. What if her connection to this story wasn't coincidence? What if James Carter wasn't simply a soldier whose letters she had discovered? What if he was part of her story, a part of her family? The idea terrified her, but it also ignited something she hadn't felt since childhood. Hope. Real hope. Not the fragile kind she used to carry to the orphanage window every Christmas. Something stronger. Because for the first time in her life, Grace wasn't just searching for answers about the past. She was searching for where she came from, and somewhere beyond the letters, beyond the church, beyond 70 years of silence, the truth was finally beginning to come into view. For most of her life, Grace Walker believed the hardest part of her story was not knowing where she came from. She was wrong. The hardest part was discovering that the answers had been closer than she ever imagined. For weeks after her visit to the nursing home, the elderly secretary's words refused to leave her mind. "You have his eyes." At first, Grace tried to dismiss it. People saw patterns where none existed. People made assumptions. And yet, every time she opened James Carter's journal, every time she looked at the faded photograph attached to his military record, she felt the same uneasy pull. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. His eyes, his smile, even the way he tilted his head in photographs, the similarities haunted her. Still, Grace wanted facts, not hope. Hope had disappointed her before. So she kept searching. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. One afternoon, a genealogist named Robert Hayes called from Ohio. For weeks, he had been helping Grace trace military records connected to the letters. His voice sounded different this time, more serious, more careful. "Grace," he said, "I think I found something." Her heart immediately began to race. "What is it?" There was a brief pause. Then Robert explained. Among several archived church records, he had located documents connected to the infant mentioned in James Carter's file. The records were incomplete, but one detail stood out. The child had eventually been transferred into the state adoption system, the same system Grace had entered decades later. Grace gripped the edge of her desk. Her pulse thundered in her ears. "That doesn't prove anything." "I know," Robert said gently, "but there's more. The child had a daughter. That daughter later became a mother herself. And according to the available records, her child had been placed for adoption shortly after birth." Grace stopped breathing. The room seemed to tilt around her. Because that part sounded familiar. Far too familiar. A few days later, Robert arrived in Willow Creek carrying a thick folder of documents. Together, they sat inside Willow Hill Church beneath the afternoon sunlight. Neither spoke much. Neither wanted to say what they were both thinking. Finally, Robert opened the folder. Birth records. Church records. Adoption paperwork. Fragments of lives separated by decades. One document led to another. Another led to another, like pieces of a puzzle slowly falling into place. And then they found it. The missing connection. The document that linked Grace's adoption records to the same family line connected to James Carter. For a long moment, Grace simply stared. Her eyes moved across the page again and again. The words never changed. The truth remained. James Carter wasn't a stranger. He wasn't just a soldier whose letters she had discovered. He was her great-grandfather. The church fell silent. Grace felt tears gathering before she even realized she was crying. 23 years. 23 years of wondering. 23 years of believing she had come from nowhere. And suddenly, she didn't. She belonged to a story. A real story. A family. A history. A name. For several minutes, she couldn't speak. Robert quietly handed her a tissue. Neither of them said much. There are moments in life so profound that words only get in the way. This was one of them. But the story wasn't over. In fact, it was only beginning. Through additional records, they discovered something even more surprising. Grace wasn't alone. Several distant relatives were still alive, scattered across different states. People who had never heard of her. People who had no idea she existed. The possibility terrified her. What if they didn't want to know her? What if they rejected her? What if she had built up this dream only to lose it again? For days, she carried those fears in silence. Then, one evening, she opened James Carter's journal. A familiar page fell open. The same entry she had read countless times. If I don't come home, I pray my child never believes I abandoned them. Grace stared at the words, and suddenly she understood something. James had spent his final days hoping his child would know the truth. If she walked away now, that truth would remain unfinished. So she made the call. The first conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Awkward, careful, emotional. The second lasted nearly an hour. The third stretched even longer. One call became many. Many became relationships. And before long, plans were made. Several weeks later, a small group gathered at Willow Hill Church. Grace arrived early that morning. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely unlock the doors. She had imagined this moment her entire life, and yet nothing could prepare her for it. One by one, cars pulled into the church parking lot. People stepped out, some elderly, some middle-aged, some carrying old photographs, others carrying stories, all carrying questions. For a few seconds, everyone simply stood there, looking at one another, trying to recognize pieces of themselves in unfamiliar faces. Then an elderly woman stepped forward. Tears already filled her eyes. She looked at Grace for a long moment, then smiled. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. "You look just like James." The words broke something open inside Grace. The years of loneliness, the unanswered questions, the fear, the grief. All of it seemed to rush out at once. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't standing alone. The church that she had purchased hoping to find a home had given her something far greater. It had given her roots. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Grace remained inside the sanctuary. The setting sun painted the stained glass windows in gold and crimson. The letters rested safely inside display cases. James's journal lay open nearby. She looked around the church and smiled through tears. Months earlier, she had come searching for a building worth saving. Instead, she had found a family. And perhaps something even more important. She had finally found herself. For the first time since she was a little girl sitting beside that orphanage window on Christmas Eve, Grace no longer wondered whether anyone had ever come back for her. The answer had been waiting beneath Willow Hill Church all along. And now she knew. She had never truly been forgotten. The morning Willow Hill Church reopened. Grace arrived before sunrise. The air was cool, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and fallen leaves. A thin layer of fog rested across the fields below the hill, softening the landscape into something almost dreamlike. For a few moments, she stood alone at the bottom of the church steps, just looking. A year earlier, those same steps had been cracked and covered with weeds. The windows had been broken. The roof had leaked. Most people in Willow Creek believed the church had reached the end of its story. Now, warm light glowed behind the restored stained glass windows. Fresh paint covered the weathered walls. The bell tower stood proudly against the morning sky, and hanging beside the front door was a simple wooden sign, "The House of Forgotten Letters." Grace stared at it and smiled. There had been days when she thought she'd never reach this moment. Days when she questioned everything. Days when she sat alone in the sanctuary, wondering whether the church, and perhaps even she herself, could truly be saved. Yet here she was. And somehow, the church was still standing. So was she. By mid-morning, the first visitors began arriving. Then more followed. And more after that. Cars filled the gravel parking lot. People traveled from neighboring counties. Some came from neighboring states. Many carried photographs. Some carried old family records. Others carried nothing but curiosity. Grace greeted each person at the door, not as guests, but as family, because in a way, they all were. Every person who stepped inside had come searching for something. A memory, a connection, a piece of someone they loved. The church welcomed them all. Inside, displays lined the walls. The recovered letters rested carefully beneath glass. Photographs of soldiers hung beside photographs of the families they left behind. James Carter's journal occupied a special place near the altar. The same journal that had changed everything. Visitors moved slowly through the exhibits. Many spoke in whispers. Some cried openly. Others stood silently, reading words written decades earlier by people who never imagined anyone would read them again. Grace watched an elderly man stop before one particular display. His hands trembled as he reached toward the glass. Inside was a letter written by his older brother, killed in Europe before the man had even started elementary school. The brother he had never known. The brother whose voice he was hearing for the very first time. The man wiped away tears and simply whispered, "Welcome home." Nearby, a grandmother sat reading a letter with her granddaughter beside her. 3 generations connected by words written before any of them had been born. Again and again. Grace witnessed moments like these throughout the day. Small miracles. Quiet miracles. The kind that happen when people finally receive answers they have waited a lifetime to hear. As the afternoon sun drifted lower in the sky, the church became filled with conversation. Stories flowed from every corner of the building. Veterans shared memories. Families shared photographs. Neighbors who barely knew one another suddenly discovered connections stretching back generations. The church no longer felt like a museum. It felt alive, exactly as Grace had hoped. Then, shortly before sunset, something happened she would never forget. Harold Jenkins, the oldest living member of Willow Creek, slowly walked to the front of the sanctuary. At 92 years old, Harold had attended Willow Hill Church as a boy. He remembered weddings held beneath these windows, funerals, Christmas services, community gatherings. He remembered the church before it was abandoned, and now he was seeing it reborn. The room gradually fell silent as Harold cleared his throat. His voice was weak but steady. "I thought this place was gone forever," he said. The crowd listened. "I thought its story had ended." His eyes drifted toward Grace, then toward the letters, then toward the families gathered throughout the room. But stories don't die when people remember them. Silence filled the sanctuary. Several people wiped away tears. Harold smiled softly. Then he pointed toward Grace. This young woman didn't just save a church. His voice broke. She brought people home. For a moment, Grace couldn't breathe. The room erupted in applause. Not loud applause. Not the kind heard in stadiums. Something gentler. Something warmer. The sound of gratitude. The sound of people recognizing what one determined person had accomplished. Grace lowered her head. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Because they didn't know the whole truth. They thought she had saved the church. But the church had saved her too. As evening settled over Willow Creek, strings of warm lights illuminated the church grounds. Families lingered long after sunset. Children played in the grass. Old friends reunited. Stories continued to be shared. And for the first time in more than 30 years, the church bell rang. The sound echoed across the valley. Clear, strong, alive. People stopped talking, stopped walking, stopped everything, and simply listened. Some smiled, some cried, Grace did both, because that bell wasn't just announcing the reopening of a church, it was announcing something far greater: the return of forgotten voices, the healing of old wounds, the restoration of a history that nearly disappeared. Later that night, after the final visitors had gone home, Grace walked through the sanctuary alone. The building was quiet once again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. A peaceful quiet, a fulfilled quiet. She stopped beside James Carter's journal. Carefully, she opened it to the final page. Beneath James's last entry, she had written a single sentence in her own handwriting. "You were never forgotten. We just hadn't found your story yet." For a long moment, she stood there. Then she closed the journal gently. Outside, stars filled the Kentucky sky. The church lights glowed softly behind her. And as Grace locked the front door, she realized something she had never believed possible. The little girl who once sat beside an orphanage window waiting for someone to choose her was gone. In her place stood a woman who had found her family, her purpose, and her place in the world. And somewhere, she liked to believe, James Carter was smiling, because after 70 years of silence, someone had finally come back. And this time, they stayed. Not everyone would have seen hope in an abandoned church. Most people saw a building that had been forgotten. Grace Walker saw something worth saving. Perhaps that was because she knew exactly what it felt like to be forgotten herself. For 23 years, Grace believed she had been left behind. She believed nobody had come back for her. Nobody had searched. Nobody had cared. But standing inside Willow Hill Church one final evening, she finally understood the truth. James Carter never came home from the war. The letters he wrote never reached the people he loved. The child he worried about grew up without knowing his name. And for decades, it seemed as though his story would disappear forever. But stories have a way of surviving. Sometimes they survive in old photographs, sometimes in forgotten letters, and sometimes they survive in people. 70 years after James Carter was gone, a young orphan girl walked into an abandoned church searching for a place to belong. She thought she was saving a building. Instead, the building was saving her. The church wasn't waiting for Grace to save it. It was waiting to save Grace. A few months after the church reopened, Grace returned to St. Mary's Orphanage. She walked into the same dining hall where she had spent so many Christmas Eves waiting by the window. The same room where she watched other children leave with families while she remained behind. For a moment, she sat quietly in the chair she used to occupy as a little girl. Then she smiled, because she finally understood something that child never could. Nobody had forgotten her. The answers had simply taken longer to arrive. And this time, she wasn't alone. She carried photographs of family members she had finally met. Letters that connected her to generations she never knew existed. And a story that had led her home for most of her life. Grace wondered why nobody came back for her. Now she knew. Someone had. It just took 70 years. Because in the end, this was never really a story about an old church, or lost letters, or even a forgotten soldier. It was a story about belonging, about second chances, about discovering that even after a lifetime of questions, hope can still find its way back to you. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Some people leave behind money, some leave behind buildings. James Carter left behind a path that led a lonely girl home.